Well, thank you, General. You know, this is my first time back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base since I retired, largely because of COVID. And so when I got the invitation from General Pringle to come and speak to AFRL, I was just delighted. As General Pringle said, I cleared my calendar and said, I will be there, because truly, to me, this is like coming home. You know, I served for 36 years, and I will tell you, hands down, by far, the best organization that I was ever part of and was part of me was the Air Force Research Lab. In fact, my very first Air Force Research Lab assignment, which was 8 years into my career, was up at Rome Labs. So call out to my fellow Romans, and I can tell you that it truly was a life-changing event for me. It was during that assignment that I determined who I really was and what I wanted to do as an Air Force officer. So that's why coming back to talk at an AFRL Inspire was a great opportunity to me to share my story with all of you for the very first time. See, I was a reluctant joiner of the STEM community. You know, I went to a Catholic grammar school, and math and science was rote learning. You know, I had a pretty good memory. Those of you who work for me might say that it was a little better than pretty good, since they tell me I never forgot anything. And so I got decent grades in math because I could memorize my multiplication tables, and I practiced a lot of long division, so I could do that. And science was just memorizing facts. I didn't like science that much, though, because I didn't like those science fair projects. Because science fair projects were really art projects, weren't they? At least when I was growing up. And we didn't have computers, and so you had to draw, and you were writing things out, and I just wasn't very good at that. In fact, you know, one of the challenges I've had since I retired is color coordination when I'm going out, since I don't wear the same thing every day. So, you know, all gray works, right? So, you know, I left grammar school not at all interested in math and science. I really wanted to be a writer. That was what I wanted to do. And in the beginning in high school, things didn't get much better because my dad made me take drafting or mechanical drawing. Anybody in here old enough to remember taking drafting? I hated that class. Now, let me tell you why my dad wanted me to take drafting. My dad was a first-generation American. My grandmother and my grandfather came from Poland. And my grandfather died when my father was in high school. And he watched my grandmother, who was basically illiterate, and she pulled my aunt out of school to clean houses to support the family. And my dad, I had 3 sisters. My dad was determined that his 3 daughters were going to be able to take care of themselves. And so he really emphasized the importance of education, and so he wanted me to take drafting so that I would have a skill that I could use to be able to support myself. And by the way, my mother made me take typing in the 9th grade because she was a secretary and she thought that was an important skill. And by the way, she was right. That was the most valuable class I ever took in high school, was that typing class. So and why did I hate drafting? Well, kind of the same reason as those art projects. You know, drafting was all about, you know, being able to put things in 3 dimensions and draw it, but my grades seemed to be dependent on whether I made the line thickness with this pencil consistent across and the lines were straight, right, Tim? And I just wasn't very good at that, right? Thank God for computers and CAD for me. But then something happened in my junior year. My math teacher turned out to be, I should also want to caveat that the thing I hated the most about math when I was in grammar school were word problems. Word problems. Why do you just give me the problem? Why do you have to make me sort through all these words to get to the thing I have to solve, right? So I hated word problems. Now think about what I did for 36 years, right? I solved word problems. So my math teacher was the JV baseball coach. And he came in after class one day, he looked at me and he says, "You're the JV scorekeeper." And I looked at him and I said, "Hey, Coach, I know nothing about baseball and I have no interest in being a scorekeeper." He says, "Be at the field at 3 o'clock this afternoon." So I went, and for an entire season, I sat next to him on the bench. And I kept score, and I kept all the statistics, and he taught me the strategy of baseball during that season. Okay, we're going to put this person, I need to figure out who's going to be my center fielder. And he would ask me questions about the statistics of individuals. He would ask me, I had all the records for all the other teams, and he would explain to me when he was shifting, and he would tell me to go find out what the score was at the varsity game and when it was we needed to start. We had the relief pitchers sitting down with us when we needed to start. And he left me with 2 lifelong gifts. One was a love for baseball strategy. And the second was he taught me to understand the value of word problems and being able to take those and translate them into things. A skill that was so, and it also opened my eyes that this stuff was not just memorization. There was things you could actually learn behind these things. So when I graduated high school, I went to engineering school, not because I was thrilled about being an engineer, but remember back to my dad, right? And how important it was that we all would be able to support ourselves. And since I had good grades in math and science, he said, "You need to go be an engineer." Well, I still wanted to be a writer. I was the editor of my high school newspaper, co-editor of the yearbook. So I went there saying, okay, so allow me to be looked at it as a job. But during the time I was there, I had to take drafting over again, by the way, because everybody had to take drafting. But this time I got an A. During that time, I began to see more and more how much I enjoyed this word problem thing, and applying it, especially in labs where you really did lab work. And since I loved to write, it was kind of neat to write about what you were discovering. So by the way, I never had problem finding lab partners. I always had them lined up at my door saying, "Hey, will you be my lab partner?" Because they knew that I'd write the reports, which everybody hate, as you know, engineers hate to do. And then when I was ready to graduate, here's this kid who didn't even want to go to engineering school, and I went off to Berkeley to get my PhD in thermodynamics, and it was because in my junior year, I had a thermo teacher that realized how much, thermo was so simple, right? What goes in must come out. Everything balances. And my professor said, if you want to do this kind of work after you leave the Air Force, because I had joined ROTC, which was another reinforcement for me to be an engineer, because in 1974, when I joined ROTC, there were not very many jobs open to women. We couldn't be pilots, we couldn't be navigators, we couldn't be missileers, and the Air Force was downsizing at the end of the Vietnam War, and about the only way to get into the Air Force if you weren't an operator was to be an engineer. So that more enforced me, and I had joined ROTC out of curiosity, but I loved the culture, and I loved being part of something bigger than myself. So that reinforced me being an engineer. So I went off, I finished graduate school, found the love of my life while I was in ROTC, my husband, and so for the first 8 years plus, frankly, of my military career, I really wasn't thinking about science and technology. My focus was, how did my husband and I find assignments so that we could stay together, and we were raising a family. I had 2 young children, and so at about the 8-year point, I got my first AFRL assignment, which at that time was technically Rome Air Development Center, which some affectionately called Relax and Drink Coffee. And about 3 months after I got there, it became Rome Lab, and I was there because there's a B-52 at Griffiths Air Force Base, and my husband was a B-52 radar navigator. So I was only there because it was his assignment that drove me there. And when I when I was there, though, it really was where I found out what I actually loved. Is there a problem? Okay. So I got up there, and there was all sorts of cool things going on up there. Real technology. You know, we were talking about history. And as I was preparing this talk, I realized how much history I was seeing real time. I walked into one laboratory, and there was this real rudimentary setup of optics that was exploring essentially automatic target recognition. And by the way, we had the internet. We didn't have World Wide Web. That didn't exist yet. We were doing file transfer protocols and things like that, but we had the internet. And it wasn't something you found anywhere. And then we had work being done on voice recognition. And there was this thing the size of a sugar cube that they were telling me had as much memory as the 3 stacks of computer files that were in the other room. And now think about, we got like 10 times what was in that sugar cube in your cell phone today. And then there were these guys at Hanscom that were attached to Rome that were doing something all excited about cold atoms. Now remember, this was 1991. And these were the cool things that they were doing. And I remember the guys up at Hanscom were saying, yeah, and you know, we think we can do a navigation system with this. Well, it's a building almost, right? With all these refrigerators and all of these optics benches. I was like, what in the world? But there was the other end of the spectrum at Rome as well. We were directly supporting the intelligence community for their data handling system. And then what happened in 1990? Anybody remember? Desert Storm. And all of a sudden, the laboratory's focus shifted from thinking about 10 years from now to how do I deliver capability tomorrow to the B-52 radar and all these other things. And that's when I saw what really became my passion, which was delivering technology, making technology work and allowing it to be a part of this great Air Force. And that's where I formed the phrase, General Pringle, that I hear you use all the time, is that technology doesn't know its application until we tell it. And what I also realized is that it takes a team and a team of individuals in order to be successful, a team of scientists that have different skills, the first of which is you need those visionaries. You need those people like those scientists at Hanscom that could see this room full of, you know, refrigerators and optics and say, there's a navigation system in there somewhere, right? And you need, so I call those the visionaries. The only problem with visionaries is that they're not real good at predicting how long and what it's really going to take to get from where we are today to that vision. And so I remember a quote from one of my heroes of my generation when it comes to technologies, and that was Admiral Rickover. And Admiral Rickover said, "Great ideas and innovation must be driven into existence with courage and patience." So the second group of people that I believe are important that I saw up there at Rome are what I call the technology drivers. They're the ones that can take that vision and have the courage, because trust me, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of patience to be able to drive it into its existence. So I call them the drivers. But then there's a third group of people that are so critical, and they are those that I call the bridgers. Those are the people that can talk to the technologists and understand what the technologist is saying, and at the same time talk to the operator, the warfighter, and understand what the warfighter needs, and to provide that bridge between them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am not a visionary. I would sit there and scratch my head and think, how did they even think of that? You know, why would they even be thinking about that? I am a technology driver, and it's where my passion is, and it's what I love to do, and it's what I dedicated the rest of my Air Force career doing in almost every assignment I had, even when you didn't think it was something that was so driven by technology, because technology is the core of our Air Force. And the third, Bridger, I wasn't a bad Bridger. It wasn't my strong point, but because I was a military officer and I'd gone to all the training, you know, I understood the ops side a little bit, and then as the more senior I got and found myself not only the only woman in the room, but also knowledge. And I was able to use those opportunities of being with Air Force senior leadership as a 3-star and as a 4-star to be that bridger, to try to bring that too. So for me, it was during that time that I realized where my real passion was and what I wanted to focus on for the rest of my career. At the same time, my husband discovered that, shared with me that what he really wanted to do was be a high school math teacher. And so we made a decision that he would separate from the Air Force and pursue his, being a high school math teacher, and I would stay in. And so that assignment was a major turning point for me. It was up to that point, I had not even decided whether I was going to stay in the Air Force or not. At that point, whether I stayed in the Air Force or not was whether I could continue to have assignments where my husband and I were together. Well, it was 17 years before I returned to AFRL. But in those 17 years, AFRL was never far from where I was, because I still kept that passion of trying to bring technology to bear to help our warfighters come home safe. And during those 17 years, there was one assignment that stands out in particular for the importance of being that technology driver and, frankly, my relationship with AFRL, and that was as the Airborne Laser Program Director. In fact, I had people that would tell me that I had the Air Force science fiction project, right? And it's interesting to listen you talk about the history, because that program was the hardest job I had in the Air Force by far. I had visionaries. Most of what we did, and a lot of the people in the program office, although we were not officially part of AFRL, or actually came from AFRL or essentially detailed from AFRL. So I had the visionaries. And as my good friend Doug Lavero, some of you may know, is also an AFRL alum, when I first got that job, he called me up and he says, "Ellen, you need to remember that laser physicists lie." And I had to go back and correct him. I said, "No, Doug, they don't lie. They're just visionaries. And they could see what they thought these lasers could do, right? Huge potential. But there was a little bit of detail about how to actually get there that they really didn't quite understand." So perfect role for me as a technology driver, right? And then I had the challenge with the bridgers too, because most of the operators in the Air Force at that time had grown up watching Star Wars and Star Trek. And so our operators had a very unrealistic view of what a laser system looked like. No, you can't hold it in your hand and evaporate somebody, right? You know, you got 3 crates full of stuff to get out a small amount. Every day we were on the verge of a technical catastrophe that could end the program. This is where the courage came in. Because we had this big piece of glass for the window, and if somebody dropped that or dropped something on it or cracked it, 5 years to replace it. And then in the Pentagon, there was a group of people, very influential people, that were driving to cancel the program. So it took tremendous courage. In fact, twice during that job, I was on the verge of resigning because I didn't think I could continue to do it. And at the same time, as a leader, my focus was to fend off all of these threats from the team so the team could keep focusing on moving one step forward. And if there's any ABL alum out here, and Mike Gregg, by the way, was an alum of sorts because he was at the Missile Defense Agency, so Mike, a call out to you if you're out there. At any given time, that program could be canceled because of something else. And so I remember at one point I went to Lieutenant General Ron Kadish and I said, I just don't think I can do this anymore. And he says, suck it up, you're not going anywhere. And I turned many, many times to my AFRL friends during that time period, and it truly was a part of this ecosystem that AFRL is the heart and soul of the technology for our Air Force. In fact, when you look at the crucible and what was produced in terms of technical leaders out of the Airborne Laser Program Office, I think you'll be surprised. Susan Thornton, Director of Directed Energy, retired as on the air staff, was the Director of Engineering. Tom Fisher was her deputy. He recently retired, I think, as the LCMC engineer or AFMC engineer. Heidi Bullock, contracting officer, because it's a team sport. And contracting officers are just as important to what we do as engineers and scientists. Robert McMurray, a fellow Air Force Research Lab. He's the guy, by the way, that had I talk about patience. You know, when I joined that program in 2000, we were supposed to shoot down a missile in 2004. Well, Robert McMurray finally accomplished that in 2010. So there was a giant P in patience if you were the Airborne Laser program director. Kelly Hammett. Kelly was a major, and now he's the director of the Rapid Space, right. So when you look at that program, even though those 17 years I was not actually part of AFRL, AFRL was there with me in that most challenging time. So I did come back in 2010 as the AFRL commander, and many of you know this was a very difficult time for me personally. In a 3-month time span, I lost my husband to a heart attack and my sister to lung cancer. And in both cases, it was the support in my AFRL family that helped me to get through that time period and to continue to pursue my Air Force career. At the same time, it was during another one of the General Pringle and I were talking about this cyclical time of AFRL. The Air Force leadership was like, hey, you guys just aren't relevant. What have you done for me lately? And the MAGCOMs were not happy about what they were getting. And so when I came here, I had to rally the troops. Frankly, it was a little bit of an imbalance at the time. Too many visionaries, not enough bridgers. So we put together what at that time was called our flagship programs, not dissimilar than the Vanguard programs. You remember, Daryl? And we empowered a bunch of great bridgers by the name of Beach Wilcox. So you remember Beach, Dave Hardy, work in space, and of course, the greatest bridger that I have ever met in my whole life, Alok Das. I don't know if Alok is still with you, but he was the best bridger we ever had. And as a result of that, we really turned things around. And AFRL got back to its status as being, you know, essentially the brain trust of the technology. And when I came back as AFMC commander, many of those processes were still in place. I understand from General Pringler, we've done another refresh, not unlike the things we were trying to do. And so it's like I said, it's a cycle. So it was the AFRL team that once again helped me during a difficult time in my life personally and a difficult challenge I had as the AFRL commander. And finally, my last assignment is the Air Force Materiel Command commander. Remember I said even though in theory it looks like I'm not responsible for driving technology, I was handed a task by then General Welch to do something about strategic development planning and experimentation. And this was supposed to be a MAGCOM level thing. Well, you know who I turned to. I came to AFRL and I said, I need you to stand up this office. We need visionaries because development planning, you're looking way into the future. We need technology drivers because it's got to make sense and we got to know how we're going to get there. And we also need bridgers. So I pulled out Jack Blackhurst, who I think has retired, but and Chris Ristic, who I think is still here. And I think it's a testament to AFRL that that office is still there, has expanded its function, and has survived 3 chiefs of staff and 3 or 4 different secretaries during the time it's been in existence, and delivering on those on that technology, providing technology. In my last assignment, to meet the challenges that I faced. So now I'm here today. Now I'm an old technologist. Miss every day the opportunity to be in there, you know, in the trenches. I used to come over here when I was the AFMC commander to get, because I would quote unquote suffer from hardware withdrawals, like I said, when I'm tired of listening to view graphs and briefings and I needed to go see some real things happening. But one of the things that's nice about, you know, spending 36 years in the Air Force is that patience starts to pay off. And you start to see so many of the things that you worked on that were just visionary ideas become reality. And when I heard that this was a 75-year anniversary, I was in the Air Force for 36 of those 75 years. I lived the second half of that history. And that is so cool. And when you start to think about it and you look at the major events in that history and you realize the impact of the work of AFRL, every single one of those. I came in during the Cold War. We won the Cold War, not because we massed major troops in Europe. We won it with our technology, remember? The Soviet Union just could not keep up with us. Won for us. The next really major event in my career was Desert Storm. Where did stealth come from? Where did GPS come from? Where did the command and control systems that we were using during Desert Storm come from? Don't mention the tremendous things that AFRL raced to the field during Desert Storm. All of the technology that came to bear during Desert Storm was ours. It was our visionaries and our technology drivers and our bridges that brought it there. And then, you know, I look now at the latest big thing about, you know, commercial guys, they're doing more than us. Look at that technology. Almost all that technology had its roots here. Artificial intelligence. I mean, they just did a little better job, the commercial guys, in the bridging piece, which seems to be the one we always have to come back to, Heather, right? In the bridging piece. But it's all there. And it's all what's making a difference for us today. And it's what you do today is going to be what's going to make a difference in the future. So I want to finish the way I finished every commander's call that I had, with one last thank you to you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today, but most importantly, thank you for what you do every day. Because there are soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, Marines, and Guardians that come home safe because of what you do. So thank you for the opportunity, General Pringle, to share my story. And hopefully some of you will have the opportunity to live your dream like I did. Because at Rome Lab, it's where dreams become reality. As long as you got visionaries, drivers, and bridgers. Thanks, everybody.